off. We also ask that you mute yourselves at this time. My name is Jasmine Shoemaker, and along with my colleagues Emily Cullen, Susan Graham, and Simhar Yohannes, coordinate the Spotlight Guest Instructor Workshop Series. In this series, we invite university community members and friends to share their research and creative endeavors in one-hour talks hosted in the library or virtually. Due to the ongoing success of the Spotlight series, we have expanded the parameters to create a semester-long themed symposium. This fall 2022 semester symposium, titled Prison State, aims to explore the regional and pervasive impact of prison incarceration in Maryland and the current debate around prison abolition. The inspiration for the theme comes from the library special collection's prison-related materials, as well as the gallery's exhibit currently being hosted titled Prison Nation. Today, we welcome our first speaker of the symposium, Dr. Kate Drabinski. Dr. Drabinski is Principal Lecturer of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies and Director of the WIL, Women Involved in Leadership in Learning and Leadership Plus program at UMBC. Her teaching and research interests include transgender studies, histories and theories of social change, and intersectional histories in Baltimore City. She has been teaching and learning about abolition for a very long time, and she's always still learning new things. Dr. Drabinski's presentation is titled Strategies for Learning, Teaching and Learning Abolition. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speaker.
Thank you so much. Hi, people in person and on the internet. I'm Dr. Kate, and I'm really excited about this series that's been put together by this committee. It's so exciting. I first started researching and learning about abolition when I started graduate school at UC Berkeley, and you know, like a lot of stories of my life, I had a crush on a girl who was on an organizing committee for a conference about women in prison. And it took very little learning to understand that this was a topic I wanted to learn a lot about, that I wanted to be part of organizing against. And I've done that since, yeah, that was 1999, I think that was. Turned out that woman was straight, but a lot of other things have transpired from that work. And I've met some of the people who are most dear to me in my life and the most intellectually influential through this work. And it's been really exciting. So it's great to have a chance to reflect on just some of the strategies that I use in the classroom. And hopefully we'll have time for discussion in the chat, or you can unmute, or the intrepid audience members can tune in. There are so few people here in this big space. I'm going to take my mask off, if that's okay, just this one time. All right, I'm also gonna have to put my glasses up here because I can't see my slides with my glasses. That's called being 40. All right, so today we're going to talk about 47 actually, strategies for teaching and learning abolition. So here we go. All right, so I wanted to start with this quotation from the very first page. It's the opening line from Angela Davis's book, Are Prisons Obsolete? In most parts of the world, it is taken for granted that whoever is convicted of a serious crime will be sent to prison. It is our common sense that prison is how we deal with harm. That's what we do. If something's going wrong, we pick up the phone and call the police. A lot of us don't, but pick up the phone, call the police. If we suffer a harm, this is where our logic goes to where we can get redress for that harm. And in Angela Davis's book, it's called Are Prisons Obsolete? It's available as a free PDF. It was originally published on Seven Stories Press, and it's a tiny little book you could carry in the back pocket of your overalls if you're wearing them. That's where I carried it when I first started reading it. Hello. And the book is amazing. It gives just really good historical evidence, like a story about where prisons come from. Because this first quotation, in most parts of the world, it's taken for granted. That's a new thing. That's historically recent. And this tiny little book does an amazing job of talking about that history, linking it to other histories of white supremacy in the United States, the extension of slavery, and also talks a lot about how we could do things otherwise. And in everything that I teach, whether it's about prisons or it doesn't even matter, every class, the sort of main thing I want students to learn is that the world could be other than it is, right? The world that we have right now, it looks like this based on decisions people have made, on things people do, right? It could be otherwise. So all of my classes start with history, with some historical background, because it's not the case that prisons are inevitable. Police are not inevitable. These are the result of social choices. So highly recommend this book. It's such a quick read that gives you so much information. Anyway, so you're probably here to learn about abolition. So this might be a question you'd imagine I'd start my classes with. What is abolition? And trick question. I don't start with abolition. My job as a college professor, and this might be, what do you call it when some people agree and some controversial? This might be controversial, but I don't see it as my job to teach students any particular ideology. I don't expect my students to leave my classes believing what I believe. They don't know what I believe. My beliefs keep changing. Like, I don't always believe everything that I teach, right? That's not the point. The point is to help us have critical conversations and really use our imaginations to think about how the world could be otherwise. Abolition is such a hot button issue that as soon as you say it, people have ideas about what that means. People are for it or against it, even if they don't know anything about it. So it's not always a great place to start. As I say on the slide, how we start the conversation shapes the road that conversation will travel. So I start with the common sense around prisons and what common sense tells us they do, right? They alleviate harm. If I'm harmed, call the police. If someone's committed a harm against me, put them in a cage so that they can't do it again. That's the logic, and it's so naturalized that it's almost impossible to think another way. But as Angela Davis points out in Our Prisons Obsolete, there are a lot of things that used to seem inevitable and natural that aren't anymore. Chattel slavery in the United States, for example. Does it extend into how prisons work? That 13th Amendment, slavery is outlawed except as punishment for a crime for which one has been duly convicted. Yes, but it's very different from what for many people seemed like, oh, this is just the way of the world. So there is no such thing as just the way of the world. Everything is made by our activity, and we can do something about it. So this is a technique that I use in all of my classes. I have some students online and in the audience here, so you're going to be like, oh, here we go again. This is a technique I learned from a scholar activist, Judah Shept. We were on a panel together about teaching abolition. I think it was 12 or 15 years ago at the American Studies Association conference. And it stuck with me because I had so many brainstorms in that moment of, when he walked through this exercise. So I'm going to walk through it with you all. So the way that I start this is, can someone name a harm? Now, I don't say crime. And the reason I don't say crime is because what is a crime is a social decision, right? Standing on the street corner all day long, smoking cigarettes, waving hello. If I do it in my feminine, white, obviously like middle-class body, then that's not a crime, right? If I am a trans woman of color in Old Goucher in Baltimore City and it's after midnight, standing around smoking a cigarette is a crime, right? So, and it didn't used to be a crime, right? Laws against loitering, against vagrancy, laws like that, they have their foundation in attempts to control the movement of Black people after slavery. So it didn't used to be a crime, now it is. Sodomy used to be a crime. People say things like, oh, but nobody ever got arrested for that, except for the people who got arrested for it. One of the ways that laws work and crime works is that it's there to be mobilized when society wants to do something else. It's often not about whether or not a penis is in somebody's mouth, right? That's all sodomy is, mouth or anus. Like, it's not even, yeah. It's not used against straight people. Anyway, I could go on and on forever about sodomy, but I won't. This is a reason, though, why I think those laws have to get taken off the books, because when they're there, they can be instrumentalized in a snap. Anyway, so I don't ask for a crime. I'll ask sometimes for a harm, or tell me something that is labeled a crime. All right, so now I want someone either in the audience in the chat, the virtual audience in the chat, or in this audience to tell me something. Sarah. theft. Okay, so theft. If we were in a classroom with a whiteboard, I would put a big circle in the middle of the board and I would say theft. And the next step of this little exercise is to think about why someone might commit that crime. Oops. That harm. All right, so you're going to watch me maybe. Oh, it's read only. Sorry, I was going to edit it. Why might someone commit theft? Put something in the chat. They're hungry. Okay. What else? They don't have enough money. Why else? They need money. Okay. Yep. Dr. Chapin. It's their job. Good one. I'm instantly thinking of white collar criminals whose job it is to like steal money from people. They're bored. Absolutely, Ava. That's a really good one. They're bored. High school students. Desperation. Yeah. Peer pressured into doing it. I was peer pressured into stealing nail polish when I was in college. How was I still so easily persuaded? Anyway, so what? They don't know how to bring it to the register. They're defending themselves from something. They are jealous that other people have it and they want it, or and jealous isn't the word I wanted. They're upset that they don't have it, right? They don't understand piracy laws. Oh, that's such a good one. I never thought of that, right? Like a lot of us are probably stealing things. I'll like tell my students, buy these books, or, oh, we're going to watch a movie because it's on Netflix. We'll watch it in class so you don't have to purchase it. And everybody's like, oh, I can steal somebody's, and I'm like, okay, that's fine. Anyway, okay, so we've got, they don't know what's illegal. Good point. This, by the way, is how plagiarism often works. Students, and I'm going to put a pin in that for when I talk about the carceral logics that shape our teaching, because some of the ways we talk about plagiarism, same thing happens. All right, so we've got all these reasons why someone might commit that harm. Okay, I didn't write them down, but I'm going to remember a lot of them. All right, so what might put someone in the situation that causes them to commit that harm or leads to them to commit that harm? So a lot of these around theft have to do with not having any money. Why might someone not have any money? Institutional inequality, Sarah's starting right there. Unemployment, domestic violence, capitalism, right? Capitalism requires, how capitalism requires a group of people who don't make very much money, right? It requires poor people. It produces them. Addiction, I'm just watching the chat pop these up. Violence, debt, poor public transportation. Wow, I hear that one. Trauma. There are all kinds of situations that might put you in a place where stealing is the option that you take. Okay. Poor education access system, right? It's really challenging. Sometimes in some of my classes, we'll just do the math on what you make working 40 hours a week at minimum wage, and then take a look at how much it costs to live a life. And if you haven't tried to cobble that together in your own life, which many of my students have, can be really like mind boggling to see like, oh, what we expect people to do. Oh, their circle of friends. Natalia, I don't know exactly what you mean by that, but I'm thinking about how being in a certain social class means you have access to cash that you don't have access to in other circles. So for example, I had breast cancer 4 or 5 years ago, and my wonderful colleagues here at UMBC raised money for me for Lyft rides because I didn't drive, I didn't have like immediate access to a car all the time. And people, and like the library gave me, thanks librarians, gave me like gift cards for house cleaning and for food. I got so much support from my colleagues, and that's wonderful. And I got $1,000 in Lyft credits. It took me 3 years to use all those because I'm going to ride my bike unless I'm like on the ground. It was amazing. But also, if I'm in a different social class and I have those needs, when I go to crowdfund, I got nothing, right? So anyway, I could go on and on about this forever. You already have, Dr. Kate. Okay, good point. All right, so we've got a bunch of examples for what puts someone in the situation where they need money, right? And this is the problem map. It's going to zoom out, right? So for example, I'm stealing because I don't have money. I don't have money because I didn't go, I couldn't access a quality education because it was so expensive. I didn't have money in the first place. So I'm making minimum wage and I can't afford basic things. I don't know if you've been to the grocery store lately, but it's not just on TV where things are just bananas. Bananas are like the only thing I can still afford. If I think about how much it actually costs to bring a banana to me, I know I'm not paying enough. But again, that's another class. All right, so we've got this, this would be on the board as a big kind of circle out problem map, I call it. And then the question is, what do prisons do in this scenario? If the common sense is that police and prisons keep us safe from things like theft, like what do prisons do? They only address the thing in the center of that circle, right? So even if they did that, even if they could decrease theft, right? That doesn't, it doesn't solve the problem, right? If we want, because what we want is fewer harms. I don't know if you've ever been harmed. There's some nods in this classroom. Yes, Stephanie, absolutely. I'll talk about that in a second. If you've ever been harmed, but putting somebody in a cage about it doesn't fix it, right? So what we want is to not have the harm in the first place. So in thinking about building the world we want, okay, prisons only address the thing in the middle. We've got this giant problem map now with so many nodes of issues that cause this harm to occur. And that gives us a lot of ideas of things to do instead, right? So this idea that, I'm poor because, I steal because I don't have money, because I didn't have an education. Okay, so I'm not going to personally be able to solve poverty, but I can do, like, what can I do to help access to higher education? Like, and the problems are so big. And I watch students sometimes feel overwhelmed, and I sometimes feel overwhelmed by that. Like, well, can't stop, I can't fix this. But the point isn't to fix this, it's to find one spot on that giant map where you can flap your wings in the direction of the world you want and do that thing, right? And if everybody does that, also be ready for flapping those wings, getting somewhere you think you want to be and it's not right and you got to switch directions, right? Social change is always about movement and flexibility. So this is how I start talking about abolition, because it's, if we start at the end, we don't understand what it is we're trying to think through. And I think another thing we're supposed to do at getting a liberal arts education is learn to think critically, learn to not just believe what we're told, learn to have some dreams, right? I had this conversation in a class this week about why do we have to do gen eds? Is the school just trying to steal money from us? And yeah, that's another class. But if anybody wants to buy me a vodka soda, I'm a lightweight, so that's all it'll be. We'll talk about it. All right, so really key here for me is to always remember that how we define a problem determines our solutions. Here's another example. I teach a class every spring called Studies in Feminist Activism, and students have to define, like talks about some big problem, and then, hi Desiree, GWIST 200. It meets the social science requirement. It's an elective for the entrepreneurship minor and for GWIST students. Anyway, so in the class, students have to do a project that's based on something they care about. And they have to do, and so we'll do these brainstorming things like, tell me something that bothers you. And the things are always what you think they're going to be. Parking is like always one of the first ones. There's not enough healthy food available, and healthy, what people mean by that changes. It's not enough kosher food. There's not enough halal food. There's not enough vegan food. As someone who was raised a vegetarian, please no more pasta primavera. Just give me anything else. Mashed potatoes will work for me. And I remember once a student saying, well, that one of the issues, because then it branches out to stuff that's like in other parts of society. And a student said, well, service members who like suicidal ideation in former soldiers and people who are in war. And we talked about possible solutions to that. And so students were like, well, more money for mental health care, more money, and I was like, well, what if we made fewer veterans? Like, we have to be able to like think really radically. It doesn't mean we're going to do it. I mean, we are going to do it, right? We're going to do it eventually, but we have to like stay open to big ideas. We have to live to dream. All right, so I have to move these things on the screen that mean I can't see my own slides. All right, so let's talk about abolition for a minute. All right, so this conversation, once we sort of talked about like what harm happens, I'm going to put my glasses on so I can see. Hi, the people in the audience. I asked students to brainstorm, what do we imagine prisons can do for us, you know? And that list is usually pretty short. It's like, well, it can remove a serial killer so that they don't keep serially killing people. Okay, well, hardly anybody in prison is in there for serial killing. So I don't know, I'll talk about that limit case in a second. We imagine that it could be a place for rehabilitation, which of course assumes that the reason someone commits a harm is because it's about something that needs to be fixed in them instead of in the world, right? If I'm stealing because I don't have money, we need to fix the reasons we don't have money. We don't need to fix that one person. And then I'm always surprised by how many students say revenge and that is appropriate, that what we want to do is we want to punish people who've hurt us. And I get that. All right, Dr. Kate's going to be a downer for a second. My dad was killed by a driver. That driver, my dad was crossing the street in Los Angeles, and a driver took a left turn. He said his windshield was fogged up by the hot tea he had for breakfast. And I remember the punishment for the driver who killed my dad, with whom I had a complicated relationship, but I loved him and wish that had not happened, received 100 hours of community service and a $1,000 fine. And I remember thinking, it would be cheaper to kill my dad than to get your car towed twice in Baltimore City, which happens to people. And I remember thinking, this is wild. But then I thought to myself, but what would have solved this? Like, what would have fixed this? Would it have fixed it if you had to do 200 hours of community service? If you had to pay me personally $139,000 so I could pay off my mortgage? Like, no, it's like the harm happened and the prison doesn't fix that harm. And so it's a fantasy that it'll do that. And so we want to sort of push, like, does it actually give us what we think we want? And then we talk about what prisons actually do to us, right? The way that they keep us from thinking of ways to actually care for each other, to actually help each other meet our basic needs, to not, to have moments like, what if I got to sit in a room with that driver and say, hey, how did that happen? And he got to actually apologize to me. I can't even remember his name because like I don't care, but I'm interested. Like, how are you doing? You know, I want you to know from me how that's changed my life. You know, there are other things that we could do. But prisons, what they actually do is they put people in cages, and that's not a healthy place to be. They put people in solitary confinement. That is a human rights violation. That's torture. They keep people, they remove people from communities. And like if I'm not going to go through incarceration rates in different communities, but in communities of color, you can have a huge portion of people who are extracted from the community in the neighborhood and the care that they gave people in that neighborhood, the way that they supported people. I mean, just, you're not your worst action. Like that driver killed my dad. He's like more than that. Like that was like one bad turn. He was probably staring at his cell phone, which I bet half the people on this call did while they were driving somewhere already today, you know. People are not their worst moments, right? But you remove people and the resources that they have out of neighborhoods, put them in a cage, and then put them back in a community where they're not allowed to access public housing. They're not allowed to, you know, it's very challenging sometimes to get a job. Like it's it just compounds harm. And then we're not even talking about the harm that actually happens in prisons, the kind of violence from prison guards, from other incarcerated people, from not because they're bad, but because the system produces violence. It's a violent system. That's just what it is, right? So that's what prisons actually do. They also shrink our imaginations about what the world we want could look like. And that is so damaging. All right. Next thing I say about abolition, because I think people imagine when they first hear about prison abolition that it means throwing open all the doors at the jails and just saying, go on, get out, enjoy your life. There's some abolitionists who are like, yeah, let's just do that. That's not going to solve the problems, right? That problem map we have, like we actually have to solve those problems if we want to stop these harms. Students will often say, but it's too expensive. Oh my God, there is so much money. There is so much money, right? Like the money that can just like flow in once society decides to spend it that way. And just, I like to remind people, this is our money. It's our tax money. Like that's my money. It's your money. It's the social wage, as Ruthie Gilmore taught me in grad school. If you haven't read her books and her stuff, she's the best. Anyway, also she's so kind and funny. But abolition's actually about building things. It's about building the world where the harm doesn't happen. So the question that we ask then is, how do we build the world we want? And then who's building what and where? Because people have been doing abolitionist work since, I don't know, for as long as this country has been a country, right? So going back to that idea of like people thinking that, oh, for example, chattel slavery is just what we do here. Well, there were a lot of people who never thought that, right? A lot of enslaved people, right? And a lot of people who were organizing for their own freedom and for the freedom of others. Like Eric Foner wrote a great book called The Long Emancipation, and it's about how the abolition of slavery, it's not about what happens in the Civil War, it's happening from the very beginning, and we have to learn to see and understand social movements wider like that. So I encourage students, whatever issue they're interested in, and it is rarely prison abolition, to find where somebody's building something and just get involved. We read this book by Miriam Kaba in my class last semester called We Do This Till We Free Us. And she has a chapter in there called Everything Worthwhile is Done with Other People. And it's an interview. And she says, we can't do anything alone that's worth it. Everything worthwhile is done with other people. The power of organizing and working with people to figure out how to make something a little bit better. And I think sometimes we can feel like that's not enough, right? Like I think about organizing with my neighborhood mutual aid project, that I learned so much from organizing with these folks and from watching it fall apart. Like I just learned so much. All I did as part of that was get groceries for my neighbor Rosemary every 2 weeks. Like that was it. But like it's those things that are building the world that we want, right? You're not just going to one day be able to say we're done with prisons. You have to be building. So I like to really emphasize that part when I'm teaching about this material. That is slide lucky 13. All right, the other thing abolition is about imagination. And I think this is a big one. I think there's so many cultural forces that try to keep us from really imagining big changes in the world. There are so many forces that tell us that it can't be done, that like, why are we not questioning that there's $14 billion available for Ukraine? I'm not saying that we shouldn't spend that. That's not the point. The point is we've got $14 billion in a snap like that. Why don't we have $14 billion to like make sure all the schools have air conditioning and heating systems that work, so that Baltimore City schools, and I'm sure many schools around the country, can stay open during inclement weather, which is only increasing. I was listening to NPR this morning because that's what the lady friend likes to listen to, and now I'm addicted. And they were talking about the water contamination that shut down water for some neighborhoods in West Baltimore a few weeks ago. They're like, well, it's because of the sinkhole water main collapse on North Avenue. And then they were talking about the dates, like and I don't remember them exactly because I like history, but I don't like dates, like 1918. And one part of the water main was like installed in like 1878. Like this is some crumbling infrastructure. It was built at some point. We could build it again, right? So trying to keep our imaginations open so that we can actually make demands, I think is super duper important. I also think it's important to think about what repairs harm, like what can make us whole as people. And there are a lot of examples of people doing restorative justice work that can teach us a lot about this. And that's something else, like, I think it's really important to like stay curious in the world, not only because it makes it more fun, but also so you don't think you already know, right? So some people are like, oh, restorative justice doesn't work because like I wouldn't want to talk to the person who ran over my dad with his Ford F-150. Okay, well, maybe that's not for you and that hasn't happened to you yet. You might discover something else. And there are strategies for thinking this through. So don't assume you know everything. Like go find what other people are doing. And then also it allows us to have the imagination about harms that cannot be simply repaired. How do we, because many of us have or will experience just grievous harms, but we continue living. And how do we make life out of that? Like we act like grief is something one person does all alone. Like everybody experiences it. Like let's have some conversations about how to deal with grief and how to respond to harm instead of, just assuming that if we put them in prison that it will solve it, because it doesn't. I'm looking at the time. All right. So one of the other things that, because I like to think deeply about things and think about how what we call carceral logics shape our brains and limit our imaginations, right? So this might, you're probably familiar with this, people who are working on projects to say, what can you do instead of call the police? Like there are a bunch of groups who've made these like spreadsheets, like what can you do if like a neighbor's being too loud? Why do we call the police instead of knocking on the neighbor's door and say, hey, it's too loud? If there's a reason why you can't knock on your neighbor's door, like let's get to that. Like why don't we know our neighbors? What's, bunch of stuff we can do. I also think there's a bunch of stuff in higher education that is about policing and carcerality. And I mean, this stuff starts when you're in kindergarten. What do you learn in kindergarten? How to sit still, how to stand in line, how to not move your body until you're told to, right? Like that is what you learn. It's about learning to behave. And some of that stuff's important. I don't want people cutting in line in front of me. Nothing makes me mad. Well, a lot of things make me madder, but that makes me real mad. And yet I'm always passive aggressive about it. And I never just say like, hey, okay, so I'm going to add that to my list of things that I work on. Some of the carceral logics in the classroom, though, I think that we as teachers who are here, we can do something about them. So some examples of this are attendance policies, where, if you miss this many classes, then your grade drops by this much. I had those policies for most of my teaching career until I realized that, like, why was I doing that? Like, that kind of like, you put your body here in this space or you fail, that's not the relationship that I want in a classroom of like teachers and learners. Like that's, this is going to sound corny, but like we're learning together, and like I don't want to be a cop, but there's so much about higher ed that's copy, so attendance policies, late work policies. For a long time I had no late work accepted. I'm a total softie, I'll accept it, whatever. So that was a lie, but the only people who knew it was a lie were people who were already enabled to ask for it. So I'd have students who didn't turn it in because, well, you said no late papers. And then I was like, oh my God, you thought I meant that, right? You don't have the kind of like sense of entitlement that other students might have. So that's awful. And then also like the expected embodiments of students and teachers, like expecting students to be able to sit for a certain amount of time, to stand, to sit still, to not fidget, rules about no knitting, no whatever. I think these kinds of rules. And when I started teaching, I remember I taught a class at Quinnipiac University, an English class, and I put a rule on a syllabus that you couldn't wear pajamas to class. I don't care if you wear pajamas to class, but I remember I just wanted to flex my teacher muscles and have a rule that people had to follow. Like, where does that come from? It comes from the carceral training of, K through 21 or whatever. So I think there are ways to tweak these policies, I don't mean tweak. I mean, not have these policies. So here's what I do. I haven't figured out what works. I think attendance in class is really important. I think that we have conversations in class and discussions that you cannot recreate by glancing at the slides. Also, if you're anything like me, you're not going to look at the slides. And I know this because students didn't know, but we could tell how many of you watched the Panopto videos that we posted, and it was hardly any of you, right? There's something about being in a space with other people that we're doing something, right? Everything worth doing is done with other people. So I tried not having an attendance policy at all. And I mean, let's just be real. I had very low attendance by the end of last semester. That disturbs me. It disturbed me mostly because it's hard to keep a conversation going with a group of people if people aren't there, right? I want to know that you had that conversation with us about that topic. And so as we draw those lines through. So I need people to show up. There we go. Oh gosh, there's so much happening on this, but it's almost over. Okay. So what I'm trying this semester is I don't have an attendance policy, but I don't make a big deal about how I don't have an attendance policy because I'm also Foucauldian, and I know that the way norms work is that people work by themselves. So a lot of students show up whether because they're showing up. A lot show up because they enjoy the class and they're there to learn, right? Sarah's thumbs upping right over here. Sarah's in all the classes. But this time I had, if you miss more than 4 classes, you need to come meet with me to talk about how to keep you engaged in the class. And I sent out a batch of emails yesterday about that. Like, you have to come meet with me. Having to make an appointment to meet with me, I thought might be enough to get people to come to class because, wow, I don't want to have another meeting. But students don't come to class for a wide variety of reasons. And I do urge teachers to not take it personally. I urge me not to. Thank you, therapist and Zoloft, for helping me to adjust and not be so bummed. But there are so many reasons students don't come to class. Late work policies. Mine is you can have a week's extension just by asking for it, but I want you to ask for it 24 hours in advance because I want to encourage you to ask for what you need. Because 47 years old, 80% of my therapy sessions are about asking for what you need. It's like the most important life skill. So here's a chance to exercise it. And I also say, if you need more time, let me know. This has done wonders for my own teaching because I teach like 100 students at a time, and about half the students, a third of them will take an extension, so I can keep my promise of grades in 1 week because they don't all come in at once. And then I don't make a big deal about if you have to get up and go to the bathroom, though I find that students mostly are so well trained, they only do that when we're watching a movie. It's like everybody's bladders shrink when the room is dark. It can be hard to let go of some of this stuff, especially because we're trained to do it. And you just have to remember that I don't know, one way I think about it is like my class is like one very small part of a student's day and a student's life. Most of my students are working jobs, they have kids, they have people they care for. It's like, have a little perspective, but taking away from that carceral logic, I think, is really, really important. Plagiarism is another one. Students, in my experience, plagiarize because they are afraid they aren't good enough writers, so they have to plagiarize. They're overwhelmed by other work. They don't know it's plagiarism because I found it on the internet, so that is my part of the writing process. And if you're like, oh my God, nobody thinks that, a lot of students, they don't know, so like rather than having like, how do I report you and fail you, how do we build in the supports for students so that they don't feel they have to do it? All right, I think I'm almost done. All right, yes. But what about the cheaters? This I hear a lot. Every system has cheaters. Every system has, it's like, so are you gonna like commit to carceral logics in the classroom because someone might, like one thing that gets my goat, and I know that, and I've made this joke too before, like during finals periods, so many grandmas are dying. Listen, college age students are at the age where their grandparents are getting really old. If a student, and so some professors will be like, I need to see the obituary or the death notice. Don't do that to each other. That is wild. Like if some students lie about it and get away with something, I mean, they have to deal with being the kind of person who would talk about that kind of grievous harm that a lot of us have experienced. They got to live with themselves. Like, don't punish everybody else around that. When we're talking about abolition, usually it goes to what about the serial killers? And I think what I would argue is that there's not that many serial killers, and I get the point. Like, what do we do about violent criminals? Abolition includes people who've committed violent crimes. Like, you're not just that moment. Nobody is just that moment, right? So we have to build a world where that violence doesn't happen. And I don't know what we're going to do for the edge case of the Jeffrey Dahmers. And no, I'm not going to watch that Netflix series. No. like I don't know what we're going to do. Like, we don't know the answers to this, because abolition is a building process, and abolition is the horizon, right? And we have to keep that imagination open, right? That's what we have to do. We don't have to have an answer to what about the serial killers. Also, I've had students ask, well, what about sexual violence? This is so bad, we need prisons and police. And it is so bad. It is so ubiquitous. We need a world where that doesn't happen. That means we have to get rid of, like, we have to do something about patriarchy, toxic masculinity, bunch of stuff. But prisons and police have never helped us. Like, I mean, every once in a while, but for most of us, that's like the last place we want to go when we're having an experience like that. So the answers to these questions are, well, like, how do we figure this? How do we figure this out? By talking to each other, by trying things. Maybe they don't work. My poor lady friend at home knows how many different kinds of attendance policies I've tried to come up with, because I am really committed to getting away from the surveillance and policing technologies of the classroom. And I want students to come to class. So I've had a lot of different things. This is the first semester I've done that you have to come meet with me. I'll let you know how it goes. That means I have to keep track of who's not there, which I don't do, but I do notice. All right, so I want to share here at the end, oh, great timing, Dr. Kate, some things that I think are really helpful. The Barnard Center for Research on Women, which was my first job in college, and then I got all the girls I had crushes on jobs there, and they all dated each other, but not me. But that's for next week's therapy session. You'll notice I talk a lot about therapy or Zoloft or something, because I'm really trying to normalize this stuff and like let people talk about it. I don't go to therapy nearly as much as my students probably think I do. This video series is just really incredible. I showed some videos from this series on restorative justice in a class last semester when attendance had fallen way off, and I was so tired, and I was like, I cannot make this go. I'm just gonna see what Barnard's been doing, and then maybe we'll watch them. And it was in the final like reflection papers from students, it was some of the best. People really learned so much from this stuff. So if you go to this website, Barnard Center for Research on Women, Building Accountable Communities. They have these wonderful videos, really high production values that remind you it's a private college with a zillion bucks from Columbia. These are really fantastic videos, and they are about how to build ideas of transformative justice into your everyday life. Like, how do you, because I mean, we do little harms to each other, and we are harmed in different ways, like all the time. And like, how do we make a good apology? Like, how do we share our harm with others? How do we work through these harms in community in ways that don't expel people? Because that's, again, the carceral logic, right? You expel a person, you put them in a cage somewhere. We don't want to do that. So these are some really great short videos. Now I'm going to try and get back to where I was. Hold on, everybody. Oh, hold on. I'm almost, oh boy, hold on. I just want to move this. Okay, here we go. How do I make this stop popping down so that I get back to my slides?
It's like, yep, so I'm gonna exit out of this too.
Okay, you're amazing.
There
This
we
is called teamwork. Thank you. Critical Resistance is an amazing organization. I'm not going to click on this link because I don't want what happened before to happen again. But Critical Resistance is an amazing organization with great toolkits on organizing in your community. Critical Resistance has taught me most everything that I know about abolition. It's a really fantastic resource. They have videos. They have a video. The production value is funded by a nonprofit that tries to abolish prisons, not Columbia University. But they have a movie that's sort of about the kinds of activities people are doing to build different strategies. And so students get to see like, okay, what does it look like if formerly incarcerated people are the ones who are figuring out what people who are coming out from prison, what they need, and like building like programs and housing and group housing and stuff, but around abolition rather than around, make sure you check in with someone every week or something like that. We Do This Till We Free Us is Miriam Kaba's not most recent book, but second most recent book. And it's a collection of essays. And what I love about it is that there are a bunch of chapters about different projects that people are doing. Like, here's a thing that youth are doing in Chicago. Here's a thing that has, here's a project that we worked on to like stop this prison from being built. Because that's another part of abolition, like keep prisons from being built. Ruthie Gilmore taught me this too. As soon as the state builds a capacity, it just fills it, right? So if you let a prison be built in your neighborhood, it's probably not going to be in your neighborhood, but in the rural place that's kind of hard for people to get to, but that helps that rural economy, allegedly. Sorry, I lost my train of thought, so now I'm thinking about that terrible way that prisons and prison building is like an economic engine, right? Like when we talk about the prison industrial complex, it comes from the idea of the military industrial complex, the idea that, I think it was Eisenhower who talked about it, like the danger of having an economy that depends on a constant state of war. We have an economy that depends on a constant state of war and a constant state of increased incarceration. This is not acceptable. So We Do This Till We Free Us is a great, because some people pay really high price, right? Different communities pay different prices for that strategy. So that's a great book with lots of little chapters about different projects. And then locally, Baltimore Action Legal Team is a great organization. You can learn a lot about what's happening in Baltimore, and they organize like prison support when people are coming out, and you can volunteer to like drive people home, because they're just like open the door and are like, see you later. So what are ways we can support each other when we're coming out? So these are just a few resources. There are so many people are working on this now, which is really exciting. And then I'm just going to end with this. This is a piece of art that's in Miriam Kaba's piece. She's really well known for, and she's on Twitter at Prison Culture, and I learned so much from her. And hope is a discipline. And we cannot, like, sometimes like something terrible will happen and people will be like, well, I'm not surprised. And I'm like, well, I'm not surprised, but I'm surprised. Like, I need to maintain the capacity to be surprised, to be shocked, to be overwhelmed, to be upset, to be shocked that we would allow each other to treat each other in these ways. I have to maintain that, and have to maintain that sense of hope that we can make the world other than it is, because we've done it before and people are doing it right now. So I'll stop there. Thanks, everybody. Sorry, it's weird to talk to two audiences. So we have about 8 minutes for questions. So if anybody has, hey Harley, sorry. If anyone has questions, I'm going to stop sharing, or ideas, because I know there are a lot of teachers and students on the line. If there are things that have worked in your classrooms, I would love to hear about them. So either in the audience or you can drop a question in the chat. I couldn't see the chat most of the time, so yeah. What do former prisoners say about accountability? Can you say a bit more about what you mean by that? Like, do you mean, so while I try to figure out sort of more about what's in the back, oh, look, there's a cat. Hi, there's a cat. Sorry, I saw a cat. I like cats a lot. Anyway, on Instagram, there's a picture of my cats helping me make these slides this morning. So they're great. One thing I'll say is that incarcerated people are not a monolith. So some people will have it's like any group of people, it's a huge diversity of opinions. So for example, I know that one of the fights that we've had at UMBC is people have talked about how do we stop buying material from Maryland Correctional, what's it called, MCE, Maryland Correctional Enterprises. There's so much to say about that. Like for me, I'm like, we have to stop having a state investment in the continued incarceration. So we have to stop being a market for this stuff. And for a lot of people who are incarcerated, there's this fantasy, I think, that sometimes in some like circles that are sort of critical of prisons and incarceration, that people are being worked and getting paid $0 to work all the time. They are getting paid $0. But mostly what people who are incarcerated are doing is sitting around doing nothing. And so some people want those jobs, right? Want something to do. So like it's complicated, and I don't know the answers. I see a question here about workbooks or sample syllabi. I don't have any recommendations, but look, Amelia does. Thank you. I'm going to look at that one when I get home. Amelia says, I'm sure Kate has lots of other resources too, not off the top of my head, to be honest. I just keep tweaking my own syllabi. I am giving on a panel at American Studies Association this in November with some folks talking about this stuff. And so I'll bring back some more ideas from there. Yes, incarcerated persons get gain time when they work. Yep. So it's kind of complicated. Also, like not everybody who's experienced a harm is going to feel the same way about it. I know for me, I'm like, I do see your hand, 1 second. The people in my family, we all lost, a dad or husband or brother, but it's not like everybody in my family wanted the same like punishment. We have a question from the audience. Oh, comment.
Like thesis for this department. Signing, so
Awesome. So we're going to plug for some other events in this series. And his name is, again, I'm sorry, I've just been bad. Kevin Newhitch will be talking later this semester about his research on the siting of prisons, like where do we put them, which will be really interesting. Sarah.
Empower former prisoners to feel like
Yeah, so for those, you probably didn't hear that, but Sarah was talking about bodily autonomy in incarcerated spaces and how that's like the humiliation of strip searches, for example, is used to create kind of docility. And that's really traumatic. And how do we deal with that trauma? And that's really important. And I totally agree. Sometimes I think about the trauma that a lot of communities experience, people in different communities experience, like all of I was a juror on a murder trial a few years ago, and it was just devastating. Like there were kids who watched this person get killed, and the state didn't prove that the guy on trial killed the person, but these kids, like they saw that, and that's just a trauma that shapes their lives forever. I think about the trauma that I have experienced as like a full-grown adult with wild resources beyond the dreams of my youth, and so much support from family and friends, and like it's really hard still. So it's really challenging. There's so much. See, everybody in the chat knows a bunch of stuff, so I'm glad that you are sharing this information. All right, well, we are approaching time, so any last comments or questions?
This is just a comment. I appreciate you bringing it to the everyday, because sometimes these systems seem so big and out of your control. And so even you talking about your process, thinking through your syllabi and how you teach, and made me thinking about how I mentor and ways that I've been trying to create structure to like prepare people for the working world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's where maybe I can bring in these ideas while still setting people up for success. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that's really like hard and important to think about. So the comment was sort of appreciation for this conversation about how do we bring these ideas into our everyday life. So like if this example was being part of a mentorship program, and like how do you build structure that prepares people for the working world while also resisting those kinds of carceral logics. And that's like really like that's for me, that's the work. That's like what I try to figure out how to do. All right. Well, thank you so much. This was a total joy, and I wish I could see, if you can turn your camera on so I can say hi, that would be cool. Otherwise, I will see you on campus soon. Hey, Dawn. Hi. Hey, Sharon. Hi, Stephanie. Look, all these wonderful people. Hey, Molly. Anyway, so it was nice to see all of you, and have a good weekend. Don't ever change. Tell your cats I said hi.